So I want to start off by apologizing to Andrew. I know I stressed him out a little bit needlessly this morning while I was wandering around town trying to find the Union Hall. Probably the easiest building to find once you've found it. But I was running around like having Tourette's all around here going, Andrew's calling me, where are you? I was like right out there. But a little disclaimer before this talk. There's a lot of DevOps talks that I've been listening to lately that are extending DevOps in a lot of weird directions. So what I want to say is I'm not trying to say there's anything about coal mining that is part of DevOps. So like I don't want the tweet stream to look like, you know, tools and weird conversations about coal mining being part of DevOps and all kinds of weird question marks, and now vendors are going to be really confused. Although that does kind of sound fun. But what I want to talk to you about is that as I've been kind of going around working with a lot of CIOs and IT leadership people over the last several years, I think in IT there's something not unique to humans that's happening where anytime it seems like we get some sort of a new thing that happens, people don't listen very well and they don't pay attention very well, and they run off with all these half-cocked ideas. And then sooner or later, people are starting to say things like, I'm trying to decide whether you know, I should go on Atkins or do DevOps. You know, they're like comparing two different things that actually have nothing to do with each other. And I keep hearing these conversations around idle versus DevOps, and no, but we're going to do COBIT. And, you know, and I'm like, well, maybe we should do yoga, you know, because I think maybe at the end of the day, you'd have a little bit more equanimity, right? But I think what I'm trying to actually say here is I want to talk to you a little bit about some things that as I've been going through history, looking for a way to actually manage IT differently, I think DevOps is actually more of a sign that things are really screwed up in IT management than just about anything right now. And in the inability of most CIOs and CTOs and IT leaders to actually grok what is actually happening and then come up with effective plans how to manage this and get the most out of it is a real clue. So I want to talk to you a little bit about something that happened before and maybe kind of give you some warning signs of what could be happening right now. So don't draw any unnecessary correlations. Warning, IT guy talking about sociology, which I don't actually really have much of a fondness for because it's a social science. Anyway, so I'll start this out with a kind of an interesting statement. In this context, productivity failed to increase in step with mechanization. Kind of sounds familiar. So let me give you the backdrop here. So think post-World War II Reconstruction. We're in England. And at that time, we had this illusion, just like we kind of have here in America, that coal is a really good thing. And it's not, just in case you wondered. For the environment, it's kind of bad. Actually, it's really bad. But it was really, really important to rebuilding at the time because it was the primary source of energy. And cheap, abundant supply of coal was one of the kind of underpinnings that the government in Britain had figured out was going to be crucial to begin to build and get things back to normal. And so this kind of had like urgency around it. Matter of fact, so much so that the British government hired sociologists to come in and actually figure out, hey, are there some coal mines that put out more than others? What are the coal mines doing that are, you know, putting out more coal? Because the idea was this more output was going to be a big part of lowering the price of coal, so flooding the market with cheap coal. And then the other piece was that they wanted to make sure that there was never anything holding up the energy supply as they were doing all this rebuilding. So they sanctioned studies from these sociologists to go in. Well, funny thing was the businesses weren't really that cool with this because if you think about it, the way scarcity works, businesses kind of like it when there's not a lot of something, right? Because then we can jack the price up and we can actually extract more profit from the resources. So they got in anyway. And one of the things that was interesting that they found, and I'll just kind of take you through this here. We're going to go through the background, tell you what they found, talk a little bit about this thing called socio-technical systems, and I'm going to tell you there's 7 key features that I think that are relevant to DevOps conversation, and then I want to talk a little bit about how it might inform your efforts. But anyway, they got into these mines, and there was actually some big changes in technology that allowed them to start mining differently. And if you think about the time period too, there's a lot of really interesting things going on. So the guy that really started this work, his name was Eric Trist, and he started a company called the Tavistock Group. This group went on to publish a lot of really interesting things later on with sociologists. A guy named Elliot Jacks, really controversial in the HR world. He started to talk about how you could put organizations together, developed a theory of organizational models. But anyway, so they looked at the coal mines, the changes in the technology that made the old ways working obsolete, but the managers didn't understand were the fact that they could actually build these new roofs over the mines so that basically while they were in the mines, they didn't have to worry about the mines collapsing the whole time. So think of it like this. Instead of looking up the whole time, every time you do something, they're able to actually look at their work and feel like we're not going to die all the time. Taylor. How many guys are familiar with Frederick Winslow Taylor? Evil scourge. Say no more. His idea about scientific management was neither scientific nor management. And I could talk a little bit about that, but at the heart, we were dividing labor up into really, really small pieces and distributing it out among people such that people didn't actually even know how their task corresponded to anything that the company was doing. Like the pieces of work were so small and the tasks were so small, they didn't even know what each other really were doing in some cases. And this was because of this operating theory he built about humans, which was actually fairly cynical in a lot of ways. I think we've learned since then, as the knowledge work has become a big part of our economy, that this isn't really the way to manage knowledge workers. And there's a lot of research that shows that this just does not work with us. But anytime you see org charts where there's this division of labor that doesn't make any sense, we always complain about silos. By the way, the first complaints I'm seeing of silos happened well around Plato's time, so get over it. Probably before that, right? So we're not going to get rid of silos ever, probably. They're always going to exist in some form because org charts are hypotheses, right? They really are a hypothesis. At the end of the day, we have this work that we want to get done. We have all of these people, so we have to kind of figure out how to organize to get this work done. And as long as we're going to do that, somebody's going to step in and say, I know how to do that, right? And they're probably going to be called HR, and they're probably not really going to do much other than that, right? They're not going to help us figure out how to deal with what they've created, but they're certainly going to help us put it in place. So what's interesting is that the division of labor was extreme and boring. They were actually averaging 20% absenteeism in the mines after people were returning from the war. This work was extremely monotonous. You were doing the same repetitive, unrelated task day in and day out. It's kind of like being a sysadmin, right? And people just didn't want to do that work anymore. But then imagine this, like it's extreme boredom, and then all of a sudden somebody just kind of every once in a while has a random act of complete terror happen to them where they get trapped, they lose 15, 20, maybe 100 or 200 of their friends, and they're all dead. So this is your work job every day, right? You go down into this deep mine, it's completely dark, nobody sees what you do, you've only got a crew of being between 5 and 10 people, that they're your whole world. Like basically, they're your brothers, and if shit happens, it's you. There's nobody up there that's gonna get you out, really. So if you're gonna stay alive, you're gonna stay alive together. So the kind of the backdrop for this work is, it's not really transparent down in a mine. Can't see what's going on. And you know, the supervisors and managers, not so much going down in the mine. Sending the people down in the mine, right? But what was interesting is once they left the ground and they went down in the mine, certain crews started to realize something pretty interesting. Hey, all that matters is that the coal comes out and we stay alive, right? So maybe we work on it how we want to work on it. Because maybe they never know, because they don't see us. As long as the coal comes out, they don't know. Kind of sounds a lot like talking to business people, right? They come in and they tell you, they paint a word picture, right? They say, I want this thing and I want it over here, and they wave their hands a lot, and how about now, is it done, right? So they don't know how you're gonna do it. So we have a lot of freedom to organize as we want when it really comes down to it. Matter of fact, if they want it bad enough, they'll say, we'll give you what you need, right? Even though they never do. So what they found when the sociologists started going down into these mines, they found mines, by the way, where people were putting out drastically more coal with less accidents, and the morale was really high on the teams. And they're like, wait a minute, something does not add up here, because this is not a morale job, and this is not a job where anybody has incentive to produce more. Turns out, when they started talking to these miners, they wanted to switch up and learn new tasks. Believe it or not, mining has a high degree of specialization. And the reason for that is that when you're going down into the mine, you divide up the tasks so that people don't die, first of all. Secondly, you divide up tasks so people can get things done, right? There's a lot of different kinds of specialties. There's a lot of tools. Even back in the 40s, there was still quite a bit of automation going on. There were some mines even, by the way, when I was reading about this, that were doing continuous mining delivery. So the corollaries are stunning when you read this work. By the way, if you go out on Google and you Google Eric Trist, you can find his Evolution of Socio-Technical Systems white paper from the 80s where he talks about all of this. It's really fascinating reading and I highly recommend it. So one of the interesting things that he found was there's kind of 7 key traits here and I want to talk a little bit about them. The first is that these folks started to actually undo this concept of Taylorism where basically they were focused on one task and repeating it every day, all day. They started focusing on what they call the work system. These 5 or 6 folks in a crew would actually start to develop an idea of what they were doing. Like they actually became focused on the whole system. In other words, they weren't just saying, my job today is to run the pick, or my job is to run the shovel, or to run the jackhammer, or whatever it is. They would actually start to say, hey, what are we all doing to make this happen, and how do we want to divide this work up? Almost democratically. The other piece that was really interesting is the work group became as important as the individual. So we started to develop this idea that was unlike social atomism, where the one individual is actually the entire most important thing in the group. They started to see the group, because partially the theory was at the time that life was at stake, the group needed each other to function in a mine. If I lose an arm, I might not be able to operate the piece of machinery that we need to get out of the mine, so I need to know that you're going to have my back. And the only way to know you have my back is that we have some sort of altruistic relationship where we can all have each other's back. So then, as a result of this, they started internally regulating themselves. In other words, they have these supervisors. And believe me, in a mining context, supervisors are not like your friends. You know, these are people that are driving you like on a daily basis to increase output, right? Because that's how they're getting rewarded, is by increasing the output. But this group started taking care of their own discipline problems. Remember how I said there was 20% absenteeism? They were making sure each other showed up for work. They were making sure each other went to bed and they weren't out at the pub all night, right? This was also during a time in England when they had to change the laws around pubs, right? They were closing them before midnight because if you don't, nobody would show up for work the next day. Recently, by the way, they've undone that law, and it's be interesting to watch and see how those trends happen again. I'm hoping we've learned a little bit better in a couple of generations, but. So they weren't actually depending on the supervisors at all. Matter of fact, they weren't depending on the supervisors to divide up the work, to prioritize the work, or to take care of the groups. And when I'm thinking about this, when you had a good organization moving, and there's folks paying attention to detail in small teams, like a good DevOps collaboration scenario, I kind of wonder, and I ask myself this question all the time: what is it that middle managers really do? I can't answer the question anymore. I think right now, most of the time, middle management in IT is reporting status up the chain, right? Supposedly, they're helping us deconflict or solve problems, right? We run to our managers all the time when we have a problem saying, hey, I need help, and then they call a meeting, and then we all stop working, right? So really, at the end of the day, probably the biggest enemies to our productivity has to do with that layer of middle management right now. And unless we focus them, they're going to kill all of the efforts we have around collaboration. Because I'm going to show you how these kinds of things threaten them as a tribe. And when I say the word tribe, I'm using that very deliberately. We form tribes primarily to protect 2 things, right? You think about it: individual security and individual value. We band together, form tribes, protect our tribal values, tribal securities. That's why we have, in some cases, had operations and development pitted against each other for so long. Tribes protecting our own interests, right? And management was really the one pitting us against each other because we weren't allowed to have a system where we could work together. And I really think that DevOps being born, talking to folks like Andrew and Patrick about kind of the thinking of, hey, I wish these 2 folks would just work together and we could solve this problem in a few minutes versus everybody going tribal on each other and playing games. internal regulation is a key piece of this. But in order to regulate, you've got to deal with these supervisors. There's got to be some sort of external impetus for this to happen. In this case, it was safety, right? And I think that there's something really profound here when I think about Ospa and the work he's done around bringing safety and Decker's culture into the DevOps conversation. I think this is a very, very relevant piece. And I think that we need to understand how this all fits together, because safety culture was a big part of what was developing here. This is really powerful. So we have this concept in DevOps communities called the full stack goats, right? It's kind of an interesting mythology. But there's this concept from a design perspective called functional redundancy. And I'm not talking about component level redundancy or positional redundancy, but functional redundancy is an intentional concept. And this is one of the most powerful things I think that we can actually start to work towards like right away. In a coal mine, like I said, if I lost an arm or if something happens unpredictable, which is always happening in a coal mine, because if you think about it, you're actually digging into the unknown all time. You never really know what you're going to be digging into. You could be digging into pockets of gases, water, all kinds of unstable materials could be down there and cause the mine to collapse. You have no idea. You could blow things up. There's methane gas coming out of these things like crazy all over the place. So they needed to do things to help them cope with uncertainty. One of the best ways to cope with uncertainty is to increase your response repertoire, or what you're able to do in the response of an issue or a complexity. And so what they found is that by simply rotating the jobs they were doing while they would go down in the mine, they made it so each of them could learn what amounted to, when I looked at this, like the Pareto of another person's job. So what is the 20% of your job that could give 80% of the utility when a shit hits the fan? I want to learn how to do that. The only way I can learn how to do that is not sitting in a room and have you tell me about it, but it's actually by doing embodied cognition. It's actually by doing the work. So what happens is when you do the work, you start to pick it up. So one day maybe I walk alongside of you and I do your job with you, and then the next day you switch and I do mine. And we're not going to be as great at it as each other are from a specialist standpoint, but I could do 20%. And if I could pick up that 20%, it could save all of our lives. And what it does is it increases our response repertoire in the face of uncertainty. So now I don't just have my one skill. And one of the ways this plays out is like literally some of this machinery is so specialized that these guys use that, in the face of an emergency, one person that may know how to operate it may no longer be alive or be able to do it. So if we want to pull everybody out of the mine, somebody else has got to know how to start the skidder or whatever it is that pulls us out. And some of these things are not easy to just start. So learning multiple roles, and I think this is something that we can ease into. As engineers, we tend to look at this as a black and white thing. Well, I'm a DBA. There's no way I'm going to become a sysadmin overnight. And by the way, I'm never going to be as good of a sysadmin as I am a DBA. There's an article going around on the net right now about a developer saying, hey, DevOps is killing the developer. And when I read the whole article, the first thing I realized was it was based in this Tayloristic idea of how the division of labor works. Most of us that have worked in startup environments never had the luxury of an org chart. Like, we just got told, hey, there's some shit, build some stuff, and let's get it going, right? I think that's the genesis of DevOps, right? It's like, and then those people are so used to doing things like that, that when you go into an enterprise environment and you watch the silo game go on, you're like, this is absolutely mechanical and weird, right? And so I think the enterprise now looking at the work we've all been doing for a long time thinks that's just as strange, right? And this is a key to being able to handle stuff when it doesn't go like you think it's gonna. Because we're all working at scale with stuff that's breaking all the time because we're pushing it with speed and loads and things that have never been done before. So we're breaking things constantly. So we need to embrace organizational strategies that increase our ability to deal with uncertainty, not the other way around. In the enterprise, an org chart, if you think about what it really means, and you have it organized by functional roles, you actually, every time you have a functional role on the org chart, you are actually saying, we are reserving this amount of capacity because we know how much of this we need. There's no way in hell we know how much of that we need. Most of the people don't even have telemetry to illustrate their failure demand, let alone the legitimate demand. So how can you actually have an org chart like that? I question the legitimacy of all of those org charts. And as a matter of fact, one of the biggest things we should be doing is if they are hypotheses, we should be actively seeking to disconfirm that as a hypothesis. We need to test it and see whether they're real. But nobody does, ever, right? And so then we wonder why we have frustrated people trying to get work done. The other thing that they did, when you have an org chart, you're cultivating compliance to the org chart, cultivating process compliance. We wish you just follow the process, man. You know, in the mind, they cultivated judgment because at the end of the day, when stuff breaks, when you have uncertainty, processes fall apart. They don't cope with uncertainty real well. Logic and decision trees are helpful, but they do not replace judgment. And in a mining situation, they had to cultivate each other's judgment about what made sense and what was important. So they had to actually be able to have discretion in a mine. You know, you don't think of miners as being touchy-feely people, but these folks were taking time to talk to each other about things whenever they didn't go right because their lives depended on it. So they weren't worried about what your job title was. They were worried about what the mission was at the moment. So if we're going down and all things are normal, yeah, then we do our jobs. But even then we democratically decide. And I was like, well, why would they do this? Like, if I'm better at one thing and you're better at another, why would we ever one day have a democratic decision about switching? Well, it turns out people aren't always full strength, full capacity, and up to their full alertness. And some jobs require that from a safety perspective. So if I'm going down into the mine and I've got a lot of physical pain, or I've got an injury, or I've got a headache, or something really tough is going on in my life, maybe I lost a loved one, maybe that guy isn't the safety lead today. The person who can't put all their mind on that job. Maybe you say to your fellow workers when you're going down to the mine, hey, you know, since we're all gonna die if I don't do this right, I'd like to live. I'm pretty sure you guys would too. So is anybody else feeling like extra alert today? Because I'm feeling pretty not alert. And they'd had conversations like this. Or people would actually have it the other way around. You look like crap today. You were out drinking last night. You're not running the safety crew today. Or you're not running the dynamite today. Just saying. It's nothing personal. This was really powerful. Unlike Taylor, who treated humans and machines as the same thing. Matter of fact, in many cases, made humans subservient to machines. They treated each other like people. They put people first. This was a very humanistic effort that they were going through. And when they actually were using machinery, they were actually making scenarios where people were complemented by machines, not the other way around. So the way they would deploy machines was all about what was best for us. And I can tell you how this plays out. Something as simple as a maintenance interval on a piece of machinery makes a big difference in how usable it is. You know, the joke about I don't have time to sharpen my saw, I've got all these trees to cut down. We hear this all the time. Well, cutting down trees with a dull saw is actually really hard on the person doing the cutting. In a lot of ways, you're making yourself subordinate to the saw by not actually sharpening it, right? Because it does make it so much easier for you. And so these guys were actually really crazy about making sure maintenance was done and things were taken care of so that it made the work easier for them, and they would rather put the bulk of the burden on the machines. And there's a really important concept that Shingo had in the Toyota production system about this too. And by the way, this is a big trend going on at Toyota right now where they're actually replacing robots with people again and increasing their efficiency. Got a challenge. The whole point of this talk is that the way these folks found their craft again, because their craft got turned into a million discrete little pieces by Taylor Division of Labor, the craft came back together as they started to forget about what the machines were there for. Like, they almost pretended they weren't there anymore. They forgot about the automation. They forgot about all the advantages. And they actually went back to what work was before the technology there, which was a social organization. It was about people. It was about relationships. It was about taking care of each other and getting each other's back. That's all we had. They put that back into place, and the craft. You know, they were really concerned about their craftsmanship, being really good at your role, but being really good at showing somebody else how to do it. This is a big deal. When they started to do that, they regained their humanness, they felt like. And so they all talked about this. So they wanted to rebalance from a techno-social environment. In other words, an environment envisioned by engineers. Anytime we put technology into a company or any kind of automation or any kind of machinery in a company, guess who gets to say how we organize? The engineers. Guess who knows the least about what people want to do? The engineers. We actually have to make a shift, and I think DevOps is telling us something here that's really interesting. It's about the social collaboration piece and work coming first, the craft coming first, the mission coming first, and then we make the technology subservient to what we want to do. Stop driving organizations with automation. You drive people out. Automate to make more time to do the things that people want to do, not because we want to have less people. It's a big difference. The other thing about this that was interesting, remember I was saying they had 20% absenteeism because people would fall asleep and then lose an arm? Plus the work sucked and people were dying from black lung and all that stuff. The system was variety increasing. In other words, every day I could go in and I knew that if that day the thought of doing my regular job was enough to just be more than I could handle, like maybe I'd want to do dynamite on myself that day, if I thought I had to do that job one more time. You could say to the guys while you're going down to the mine, hey, just so you don't have something extra to carry out at the end of the day, me, could I do something different today? And they all knew that that was important, right? Because the whole safety thing, right? So they would be like, sure, well, what do you want to do? Right? You want to do something different today? And the thought that you could actually increase the variety of your job and actually make yourself something different and learn every day, they began to see this like a human right. Literally, this is one of the things that was interesting, is that learning on the job is a human right. Otherwise, you are a machine. You're just stamping out metal or pulling coal out of a mine every day if you can't learn on the job. So they would actually switch to learn each other's roles because boredom was dangerous, but because also boring is boring, right? They actually wanted to enjoy what they were doing a little bit. So being able to vary the job, something really interesting happened, a side effect. There's this thing called innovation, right, through exaptation. And by the way, that is a word. Exaptation is an adaptation of adaptions, right? So if you think about your cell phone, classic example of exaptation on your cell phone. David Snowden showed me this once, and I thought it was really funny. You know, we have these apps, right? And the phone orients, right, doing this stuff. You know where this came from? This didn't come from Apple. This came from IBM. Remember the ThinkPads? ThinkPads, if there's any IBMers in here, sorry. Actually, it's Lenovo now, right? The ThinkPad had this really brilliant invention that the IBM engineers came up with, where basically the hard drive had a little sensor in it, and it could actually sense if the hard drive was falling, and it would park the heads, and so you wouldn't lose your data, in theory. That same sensor, totally different purpose. So it was originally invented for hard drives. Guy from Apple said, hey, it'd be cool to take that to make the phone aware of what direction it's facing. So that's an exaptation. It's not an adaptation because it's not the same use, right? One of the things that these miners started to do, when you start varying things, different people start doing different jobs, they start asking stupid questions like, have you ever done this? Like, hey, you know, I don't do this all the time, but this seems obvious to me, right? It's the Columbo close, right? You turn around and go, hey, you know, I got a question for you. But these variations lead to variance in the way we do our jobs, which often lead to discoveries. Because when we're in robot mode, we're not really discovering anything. Matter of fact, there's a lot of people running around doing Six Sigma that are making sure that when we're doing work that we're not varying anything. It's terrible for creativity. So if you're trying to invent something or build something new, get rid of the Six Sigma, right? You know, David Snowden makes fun of this all the time, and I said Six Sigma for a reason. It's a play on words, right? It's a cult where, like, the leaders of the cult wear robes so that are like exempt from real work, right? And they run around pesting everybody else not to change anything. which is great if that's all you want, is a linear, predictable, same thing all the time. But when you're trying to innovate, that is anti-innovative. Innovation requires variation. One of the reasons why DevOps have actually, I think, been revolutionary in IT is because we're mixing everything up. We're not playing by anybody's rules, and we're seeing things that nobody else has seen before because we're trying things in combinations that are just not happening anywhere else. That's why we're moving so fast right now. Paradigms are going to shift really, really fast while we're able to do this. They're going to get really, really stagnant if the old enterprise ways get foisted back upon us. So I think this is really, really important. Matter of fact, I think it's critical because we have some big problems to solve. I mean, not just in IT. I mean, like with the whole global climate change thing. This is going to be critical. So I've got a really deep question for you. What assumptions created your organizational structure that you guys have right now? And you don't all have to answer at once. And how is DevOps pushing the boundary of this? We hear people complaining about silos all the time. Guess what? It's not about getting rid of the silos. Matter of fact, I would actually suggest that in some cases, DevOps came out of and has been helped to be formed by these silos. We're boundary spanning. I think that's the key, is the ephemeral boundary spanning based on the mission. In other words, at any given time, we see a mission. What's more important than our org structure is getting the work done. So what do? We organize in spite of the thing, and we collaborate across organizational boundaries. But the point I want to make is, who or what tribe does that put pressure on? And it's the middle management tribe. Because if my job is to report status, divide labor, deconflict, and make sure and imprint everybody in my group with the right values, and my team is self-organizing, dividing up the labor themselves, tolerating failure and imprinting their own values, inventing stuff, what do I need to be there for? And in these coal mines, you'd think all these organizations that actually got more done would be how things are done today. The interesting thing is when you read this story, you'll find out that there was somebody who killed all of this innovation. And it was the middle managers. Because they report up the chain. They're between you and upper management. They're the guys between you and the word pictures and primary colors and small numbers. And salt and pepper hair. White males. Right? So these are facts. I'm sorry. And I am sorry because it's actually really hurting us. But DevOps is allowing us to actually create a lot of variation, a lot of variety. But if we don't develop management understanding of how you run these things and how you can actually get the most out of them, middle management is threatened by this, and this tribe will activate to destroy it. They did in the 40s, they'll do it now. And the whole time the business will think it's some sort of optimization. They'll be sold by consultants, right? I'm watching people bolt really scary stuff onto what they think DevOps is right now in the consulting world, and it's really doing damage because people aren't taking the time to figure out how to build this correctly. Who changes your org structure? When you think about this, I listen to IT people talk about it, and it's like talking to somebody in the early 1900s in Russia. Well, there's a czar. Have you ever met this person? No. How would you change the organization? You can't. Why? Who did it the last time? Consultants? Right? It was right before outsourcing. Right? So it's like these traumatic, horrible things versus like in Toyota, one of the most advanced socio-technical systems in the world, where a plant might do up to 800 or 900 org changes in a year. You know who does all the org changes? The line workers. They're the ones who come up with the idea to do the changes. They're the ones who do the transitions, and they do the changes themselves as part of an improvement process that they run and control themselves. And management has figured out how to deal with this in a completely different way. Matter of fact, they figured out how to not only support it, but it's actually built into their DNA. So much so that nobody even knows why they're doing it. It's embodied cognition. They literally do the scientific method every day in a process, and nobody even knows that it's the scientific method. It's not like they're taught that that's what's happening. It's really powerful. So I think one of the problems that we've got is we're organizing based on functional. Uh, think about this. One of the things we've learned in manufacturing, by the way, I think manufacturing is an overused, tired metaphor. We're not dealing with machines and organizations. We're dealing with complex adaptive systems and human beings. So be really, really careful with your manufacturing metaphors because they don't work and they break. And they give us false confidence. In other words, what makes you feel better? We're going to roll this out and implement this new methodology in IT. You're going to plan that totally different than, yeah, we're going to herd some cats today, about 30,000 of them. I mean, when you drive a horse at a cat, you don't know whether it's going to jump at you, right? Or which direction it's going to go, or whether it's just going to let you run right over it. We're a lot closer to cats than we are machines. So start using human terms to refer to your organizational plans instead of mechanical terms that give you false confidence that just convincing people is enough. All of our behavior modifies each other's behavior. We're all agents in these changes together. And we have a lot of variability that we bring to these processes. So you got to think about trajectories, not rollouts. We got to think about democratizing work environments, not creating unnecessary order and structure that just gets in our way. So one of the problems we have is that we're organizing, even in the factory modality, it doesn't even make sense. No factory that I know is organized by putting all the welders in one corner, the hole drillers in another corner, the metal pounders in another corner, right? Actually, did I run out of corners? But it's a hexagon, right? But where I was going is that, no, we organize it based on the flow of work. We say, here's the product we're making. Here's the best way for us to organize to make the product. And then we see all of the peaceful in order. There's a whole field of industrial engineering around this. And we've learned that if we actually not only don't seat them in the right order, but actually don't put enough space between them correctly, that even messes up the equation. So the buffers are important. So we need to organize. And I think DevOps is really cool because there's enough flexibility when we all can do multiple things and we can work together and collaborate as we see fit for us to create the line we need for the moment and then get rid of it. So in other words, the human dynamic relationships can be what they need to be to get the job done because that's what's important. And that's what allows us to collaborate. It becomes the framework of what we're doing as opposed to some mechanical, well, I have to talk to my supervisor before I can make that change. So socio-technical systems can inform our DevOps effort. I think the functional redundancy piece is huge. I think a lot of us don't like the thought, especially in the enterprise, of having to try and get people up to speed on skills that they don't have. We don't have to all be experts in another field to become more of a full stack engineer. And I think this is the key that they saw in the mind. What 20% of skills, when you look around at the flow of work in your organization, what would really help for you to pick up? And not only that, what would actually round out your skill set better and make you better at what you really want to do? Because I think we all know, and we've all done this a few times, where we know there's adjacent knowledge that we could pick up that would make us better at our primary job. But because we're oversubscribed in our primary job, we never do that. And I think it's one of those sharpening the saws and trees things. We have to build time to do this. And I'm going to tell you a couple of ways that we can do this really fast. The other thing is that devs and ops can design their own interactions, regardless of the damn org chart. Nobody's stopping you from making friends with other humans. Right? And this may be a little subversive, but at the end of the day, you can make these managers look really good. We all know that we have the power to do this. We can make them look like schmucks, and we can make them look like Einsteins. Right? Why not make them look like Einsteins around the collaborative things rather than things that are actually hurting us as human beings or stressing us out? Continuous improvement. This is something that a lot of people say. I think very few people know what this means when I say it this way. I'm not talking about every day just trying harder. This is actually something that you can learn as a form. Anybody who's ever studied martial arts knows about forms or katas. We learn a kata exactly the way you do it. The perfect form over and over and over and over and over and over again until it's embodied till it becomes muscle memory, till it becomes part of who you are, right? But then if you don't spar, right? I think Andrew talks about this really, really powerfully. You don't get the variation that comes at you in nature to adapt your form to you and to the situation and learn how to be adaptive, right? You have to tell the guy, no, can you turn this way so I can hit you that from the right end? Because I learned it in class this way. And I remember when I heard Andrew say it the first time, I just like thought, oh my gosh, it sounds like IT management. The difference between chefs and cooks, right? Cooks have to set the kitchen up a certain way, have to follow a recipe to produce a reasonably competent meal. But they've got to set the kitchen up a certain way, the way they were trained. Chefs, they're picky about kitchens, but the first thing they do when they say, yes, I'll make a meal for you, when they commit to it, is they walk up to your fridge. They don't look at your kitchen. They open the fridge and they're like, what do you have? And because the chef knows a theory of taste, not a recipe, and the chef knows ratios, not a recipe, they can throw together a reasonably amazing meal without a recipe. And if the ingredients are screwed up and something goes wrong, because they know the theory of taste, they can correct it. Sounds like DevOps to me, right? Somebody who's had to deal with all the different pieces, right? It's a craft. Well, what's interesting about chefs is they can actually deal with the unexpected. The cook, not so much. Matter of fact, in a big kitchen, the cook will then call the chef when stuff goes bad. So I think what's interesting here is that we can use a continuous improvement kata or form that we can learn as a fairly mechanical, simple process. At Toyota, it's a 5-question process they use every day. First question they ask is, what's your target condition? A target condition is not an outcome, by the way, and this is really hard for a lot of people to understand. It's how I have to work in my job on a consistent basis, a way I can actually measure somehow, that if I do that, I can measure the difference between how I was and what I'm doing at where I'm working. And if I continue to do that long enough, I will hit what's called a challenge. So it's like a small unit of something that I'm doing every day that I can change. And if I do that, I will hit a challenge. And if we hit enough of these challenges, and this is where middle management and management can actually provide value, is by setting the challenges that are in line with the company's goals that we don't understand. How many times have you sat in a meeting with an executive and you see a salt and pepper guy do one of these kind of talks about, we're going there, we're going to do this, this is the goal. And they're talking in these word pictures, and you can maybe sort of see the goal, but it's like seeing the Jersey, from Newark, seeing the New York skyline. Like you can see the buildings, but you can't make anything out. But the real problem is it doesn't tell you how to modify your daily behavior to get there. So, you're going, yeah, I guess I could get there, but I can't tell if that's 50 or 3,000 miles away. I mean, that's really far. And I don't understand anything that I'm doing right now, how that even, matter of fact, I'm fighting a fire right now, and I'm pretty sure that's not what we want to be doing, right? So the continuous improvement method actually says the target condition is, how do I need to work today and how do I measure it? And then, so the question is, what is your target condition? What's the actual condition? So right away, we know we're not at the target condition, right? We're improving or striving towards something. Matter of fact, in the Toyota production system, they know they'll never hit it. It's like a continuously moving carrot that they've all bought off on because they all want to be better. It's like how you work out and train, right? So then they say, okay, what's this actual condition? Then they say, okay, give me a few obstacles, but don't spend very much time with coming up with lists. Just the most few obvious obstacles you can give me. So then tell me which one you're working on right now with an experiment. And then the last question is, when can I go see the result of that experiment? And the spirit of that question isn't to be like an executive that's saying to you, how about now? Is it done yet? That's not what they're after. They want you to not have a big, long experiment. They want to bound the experiment so that it's quick, more MacGyver-y than not, and you're not involving a ton of other people and wasting other people's time. Literally, you want the cycle to be within a day. What happens is you can't take on very much at a time because you're doing this in 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes at night, 10 minutes here, 5 minutes there. It's what you're doing in between all of your work. But what's interesting is that it sets a new trajectory. And when you finally get close enough to that target condition, the manager's like, hey, congratulations, we're moving it. And this is how Toyota went from the Ford production system in 1950 era, right at post-World War II reconstruction. You gotta remember, by the way, we leveled their industrial capacity in World War II completely, nothing there. The cities we bombed industrial capacity on purpose, flattened it. We took out the brain trust. So when they rebuilt and Toyota rebuilt, they actually copied the Ford production system. So the Ford production system, turn of the century, was producing 3 cars per person per day. Pretty awesome, right? So in 1950, when Toyota put the same system in, they were producing the same. By 1983, in America, we had improved all the way to 3.5 cars per person per day. So you're not bad for 80-something years of cranking out cars. Now you gotta remember the car technology was changing a lot too, and cars were getting a lot more complicated. But what was interesting about the Toyota system was that they went from that same 3 to 14.5 cars per person per day, with half the cycle time, half the defects, half the floor space, half the inventory, and 75% of the people in the plant loved the company. That's totally different. Because when you're improving and you're getting better at what you do, and everybody else around you always is, the esteem of your organization changes. You get a little swagger. It's kind of cool. But they're not proud. They're always humble students. There's a big difference between being cocky, right? You know you're getting better because you're striving, not because you're just awesome. So the other thing that's interesting, I think, is you can focus on the whole system views of the work. Oh, by the way, one last thing just on the continuous improvement. Small teams is a great way to do continuous improvement, and I'm actually telling people in the enterprise, I jokingly reposted an article that I was quoted in by saying one of the best ways to start DevOps in the enterprise is actually through continuous improvement. So what you can do is you can actually take a small team of about 4 or 5 people cross-functionally, some dev guys, some op guys, and they can all attack, and gals, they can all attack a problem together with continuous improvement, 15, 20 minutes a day. You can wade into the DevOps pool this way, totally, with safe-to-fail experimentation. By the way, that's really, really important. Not everything has to be fail-safe in our world. We can actually do some safe-to-fail experimentation where we actually want experiments to fail because we're doing this thing called learning. When all experiments succeed, we're not learning anything. Learning occurs when there's a delta between the expected result and the actual result. Huge, huge, huge thing. So if we're destroying variance, we're destroying our capability of learning. And by the way, most of us suck at learning because I have a theory, and again, here's a huge warning, tech guy talking about brains, neuroscience. But the 3-pound thing on the top of our head uses about 20% of our glucose in our body. Not really an efficient use of energy for a human being. Matter of fact, a lot of prolonged thinking makes us vulnerable from an energy standpoint. So we tend to revert very quickly to patterns we see other people do. We're imitators. Do you wonder why DevOps has become such a buzzword? We love to imitate each other. It's part of our DNA. It's how it survived. It's not suiting us anymore right now. It's not serving us. It's hurting us. We have an evolutionary pivot point here where we don't need to do this stuff to survive anymore. We actually need to think differently now in order to survive. So we got to learn how to learn. And one of the best ways to learn how to learn is the way we recover heart patients with interval training. Every day, 4 minutes, 80% of your strength for 4 minutes. Then it becomes 90% of your strength for 4 minutes, and then you rest. 4 minutes, rest, right? Little intervals and short bursts. Within a few months, these folks can jog. Within a few more months, they can run short 5Ks. They can run marathons eventually. But you can't just go run a marathon the day after you had heart surgery. Continuous improvement can give us both the social construct, safe-to-fail experimentation, experience with the science method, and ability to collaborate and successfully achieve goals. By the way, your execs look really smart when you do improve. And there's no one year where Toyota improved a whole lot more than any other. You've got 50 years of continuous improvement. That's how you get to 14 and a half cars per person. We are all about the big bangs in America. We always want to find a big invention that changes everything. And meanwhile, these folks are just patiently grinding it out every day and improving. Whole system views of the work. We talk about systems thinking in the Phoenix Project as being a key piece. I love systems thinking. Russell Ackoff is one of my favorite voices in this. If you haven't watched any Ackoff's videos, you should. F-Laws is one of the most amazing books I think that he's written. And the problem is that systems thinking still hasn't saved us. We need to actually figure out how to manage and work with systems better. But this idea that we need to focus on the whole system views, not what's good for my little group. I'm not going to pick a tool because my group likes it. I'm going to think about what's going to work for the system, not making local optimizations, focusing on global optimization. What is it that we need to do to serve the goal? And the big piece here is we're going to repurpose, and the work I've been doing is actually teaching executive management to manage boundaries instead of tasks. In other words, I don't want CIOs and different IT management folks focusing on what you need to do as DevOps. What I want them to do is tell you, here's where we're going, here's my intent, here's our strategic intent for the organization, here's the boundaries that I'm going to set up for you, here's what you can and can't decide, here's how I'm going to know it's working, and here's how I'm going to know it's not working, and then I'm going to ask you to back brief me and tell me what you heard me say. And then I'm going to ask you to build a similar plan. And what you're going to get is a strategic intent, an operational intent, and a tactical intent. All the same concepts, but what it is nobody's telling you exactly what to do. They're defining the boundaries that you have to work in. And then you can collaborate all you want. Then you can break stuff all you want because you know the boundaries, right? I'd much rather be told, at the end of the day, all I care about is us getting to that hill. Here's the thing. I don't want anybody from that town telling me that you're over there invading that town, and I don't want anybody in that town telling me you're invading them. I want that hill. And how it's going to feel when we have that hill, and they'll describe it to you, and they'll know, they'll tell you the success that you're going to feel from that, and then say, go for it, go do it. By the way, this was one of the things that drove us crazy about Rommel in World War II. We had all these Germans that were acting spontaneous, and we couldn't figure this out because not exactly something that Germans have been known for, especially at the army level, right? It's just self-organizing, spontaneous attacks. Discipline, yes, not this. Well, it turns out they weren't Germans. They were Prussians. And Prussians have had this long history of self-organizing teams because they manage boundaries and not tasks. So what the generals would do is they'd say, we want to cause disruption in the desert, force them to extend their supply lines, to be distracted, to do all this stuff. Here's what it's going to feel like if we're successful. Here's what it's going to feel like when we're not. I don't want to know about any of the individual missions. I don't want to know about any of the supply chain, and I don't want any chatter communications that could get intercepted. So all the teams went, self-organized, and just started attacking shit. Drove us crazy. Drove us nuts. Made us look like idiots. That's the power of managing boundaries. We could have that with DevOps teams. Wouldn't it be cool if somebody said to you, at the end of the day, we just want to get this stuff up and going. Here's what we want the experience to be like. Here's how we want the customers to feel when it's done. And here's your constraints. You're allowed to go this far to the left, this far to the right. Here's front and back. And here's how, when I hear the reports, here's how I'm going to know if we're winning the war. And here's how I'm going to know if we're losing. So you know the criteria. So immediately everybody in the organization is an expert. And they can start saying to each other, no, I want it to be more like the thing he said when we're winning than the thing like when we're not. Right? No technical terms. And all of a sudden now, if somebody comes to interrupt you with a task, you can be like, dude, the mission. Like, my task fits in this way. If I'm not doing this, we're not going to hit the mission. We can actually self-regulate when we have boundaries. So the executives have to focus more on expressing lucid intents and asking the teams involved how they would like to organize rather than telling them how. When you listen to a military general, especially in our military, the largest organization in the world is the US military in terms of command structure, org chart. These guys have been doing this stuff for a long time and we're not paying attention. Talk about blame-free culture around results. You ask a general, go back through history, they get asked this in front of Congress all the time in hearings. What will it take to hold this particular region with troops? And they'll always say, well, and they'll hem-haw around, and they'll throw out a big number, and then they'll say this last disclaimer. But I'm going to give my field commanders whatever they ask for. In other words, I don't understand what's going on the ground. They inherently know that. The only view that's worth it from a white ivory tower is the big picture of the whole battlefield. But you don't know what's going on the ground, especially down in a mine. And good leaders know this. So I want to kind of close with this thought. DevOps are closer to the work or the value stream than VPs and CXO. We know what's happening. We know why. And you know more about the work than anybody. So we actually have to have leaders helping the teams to see the whole task. In other words, what's the freaking mission we're on? Don't tell me about you need me to put a server in place. Don't tell me you need me to build you an OS, or don't tell me you need me to compile something or get some code out. Tell me why I'm doing what I'm doing so I know how to do it. And then don't tell me everything's the most urgent and important thing all the time, because you're lying. If we don't repurpose our middle managers to help us do this stuff, remind the upper level that they don't know what's going on, cultivate you folks about what the mission is, give you information about what other groups are going through. In other words, in the battlefield, the middle management folks were connecting the small autonomous teams with status information. Hey, the guys over there are kicking ass. No, these guys need your help. Just like cells do in a body, they signal to each other. We can create signaling with our middle management. If we can repurpose them to do cultivation, signaling, and managing up from a status perspective of what we're doing, so that upper management really knows what's going on in the theater, we'll get them off of our backs, we'll get them out of our tasks, out of our Kanbans, out of our prioritizations, and also out of the blame game with us. But if we don't do this, they're going to shut this thing down, or they're going to redefine it into something it's not. And I'm already watching it happen. So in all the work I'm doing with CIOs and CXOs, it's to help them put in place a system that lets us do this. Because I think this is the most important thing that DevOps is telling us, is that we can figure this stuff out ourselves. We don't need to be babysat. Knowledge work means I inherently know more about my work than my supervisor. Then why the hell are they telling me how to do it, and what order to do it, and what's important and what's not? If the organization can't communicate that lucidly, then we're all losing anyway. So I'll leave you there. Any questions?